A millionaire mocked and abandoned his wife for another woman, but her comeback left him speechless. The skyline of Manhattan stretched endlessly beyond the towering windows of Richard Thornton's penthouse, a glittering expanse of concrete, steel, and ambition. From here, perched high above the city, Richard often found himself gazing down at the world like a king surveying his kingdom. Tonight was no different. The city hummed beneath him. Yellow taxis wove through packed streets, distant horns and sirens echoed in the air, and millions of lives pulsed through the metropolis in chaotic harmony. He stood near the bar, his fingers wrapped around a glass of scotch, the amber liquid swirling lazily as he took a contemplative sip. Behind him, the warmth of soft jazz floated from hidden speakers, its mellow hum blending seamlessly with the muted glow of recessed lighting. Everything in the penthouse was curated to reflect success. Sleek furniture in shades of black and gray, modern art mounted on pristine white walls, and glass tables that reflected the city's glow like scattered jewels. It had taken Richard years to build this life. His sacrifices had paid off, and he wore his success like an armor. But tonight, the armor felt heavier than usual. Seated across the room at the dining table, Eleanor Thornton flipped through a thick financial report, her brow furrowed in concentration. The pale light from a nearby lamp cast shadows across her high cheekbones and softened the sharp lines of her face. She was impeccably dressed, as always. Her tailored navy blouse complemented the understated pearl earrings resting against her neck. Even now, there was a calm elegance about her, a quiet strength in the way she carried herself. But Richard couldn't help but feel that the woman sitting before him was different from the one he had married. He hadn't expected things to change so gradually. In the early years of their marriage, Eleanor had been his partner in every sense of the word, sharp, intuitive, and ambitious in her own right. But as Richard's career skyrocketed, her role seemed to shift. She had transitioned from his equal to someone who quietly supported him from the sidelines. She still attended board meetings, reviewed financial reports, and occasionally offered advice. But there was a distance between them now, an invisible wall that neither had attempted to tear down. The steady buzz of his phone pulled him from his thoughts. Richard glanced down at the screen, a small smirk forming as he read the message from Samantha Carter. "Everything's prepped for tomorrow. We're ready to crush it." His fingers tapped out a brief reply before he slid the phone back into his pocket. Samantha, his secretary, was a breath of fresh air. She was young, sharp, and driven in ways that Eleanor no longer seemed to be. She could charm her way into any deal and knew when to push and when to retreat. It was the kind of instinct Richard valued, especially when the stakes were high. He swirled the scotch in his glass, savoring its burn before turning to face Eleanor. "Big day tomorrow," he said, breaking the silence. She looked up from her report, her eyes scanning him briefly before returning to the page. "I know. The acquisition meeting." Her voice was soft but steady. Richard leaned against the counter, watching her. "I've decided to take Samantha with me to the meeting," he said casually, as though he were discussing the weather. "She knows the key players and can help push the deal through." Eleanor's pen paused briefly over the page before she resumed writing. "I see. That was it. No argument. No question. No reminder of how many deals she had helped him secure in the past. Just those two words, delivered with an air of composure that left him feeling unsettled. "You're okay with that?" he pressed, narrowing his eyes slightly. He had expected at least some resistance, some indication that she cared. Eleanor set her pen down neatly beside the report and folded her hands in her lap. "If you think Samantha is the right choice, then I trust your judgment." Richard studied her, searching for cracks in her facade, but found none. She was a master of self-control, but tonight, her calmness felt almost too perfect, like the surface of a lake before a storm. "Good," he said, though the word came out tighter than he intended. "I think she'll be more effective in that environment." Eleanor nodded, her lips curving into a faint smile. "Then I wish you both the best of luck." The conversation left a bitter taste in his mouth. He had anticipated frustration, perhaps even a reminder of how long she had been by his side, guiding him through the unpredictable world of corporate politics. But instead, she had smiled. A smile that felt like she knew something he didn't. Later that night, The penthouse was cloaked in shadows, the city lights casting fragmented patterns across the walls. Richard lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts swirling like the scotch in his glass. Beside him, Eleanor slept soundly, her breath steady and rhythmic. He glanced at her, the soft rise and fall of her chest, the serenity etched across her features. For years, she had been the constant in his life, the woman who grounded him when ambition threatened to consume him. But tonight, he felt as though he were lying next to a stranger. He rolled over, unable to shake the unease creeping through him. In the adjoining room, Eleanor sat cross-legged on a chaise lounge, her phone cradled in her hand. The soft glow of the screen illuminated her face as she scrolled through her contacts. She stopped at a name she hadn't dialed in a long time, her fingers hovering over the screen. James Donovan. Taking a deep breath, she tapped the name and waited as the line connected. Her heart thudded gently in her chest, but her voice remained steady when she spoke. "Hi, James. It's Eleanor." There was a pause, then a warm chuckle on the other end. "Eleanor Thornton. This is a surprise. I hope it's a good one," she replied, her lips curving into a small smile. "It is," James said. "What can I do for you?" She exhaled, allowing herself a brief moment of vulnerability. "I'm ready to discuss the opportunity we talked about. I think it's time." James's tone shifted, becoming more serious. "I'm glad to hear that. Let's set up a meeting, tomorrow if you're available." "Tomorrow works perfectly," Eleanor said, her confidence returning. "I'll see you then." As she ended the call, a wave of calm washed over her. For years, she had played her role quietly, accepting Richard's decisions and sacrifices as part of the life they built together. But tonight, something inside her had shifted. She was done waiting for him to see her worth. If he couldn't, then she would show the world on her own terms. Meanwhile, across the city, Richard was laughing over cocktails with Samantha, convinced that tomorrow's meeting would be another feather in his cap. But what he didn't know was that Eleanor had already begun setting the wheels in motion, wheels that would change everything. In the dim light of the penthouse, Eleanor closed her eyes and leaned back against the chaise lounge. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't worried about being left behind, because she was already one step ahead. As Eleanor begins setting her plan in motion, Richard is still oblivious to the storm brewing behind the scenes. What do you think will happen next? Will Eleanor's quiet strategy pay off, or will Richard catch on before it's too late? Let us know your predictions in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like this one. Morning crept through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, casting long beams of golden light across the minimalist decor. Eleanor Thornton stirred awake slowly, savoring the quiet hum of the city far below. The scent of freshly brewed coffee wafted from the kitchen, but the usual comfort it brought her was absent. Today wasn't an ordinary day. Her gaze drifted toward Richard's side of the bed, already cold and empty. She wasn't surprised. Richard had always been an early riser, a man who believed success waited for no one. For years, she admired that about him. His drive, his ambition. But now she realized how often that drive had been aimed at leaving her behind. Slipping out of bed, she moved gracefully across the room, her silk robe trailing behind her like a shadow. As she approached the living room, the faint sound of Richard's voice drifted toward her. He was pacing near the windows, phone pressed to his ear, giving last-minute instructions to Samantha. "Yes, double-check that the presentation is loaded correctly," he said, adjusting the cuff of his navy blue suit. "And make sure you emphasize our projections for growth in the second quarter." That's what they want to hear. Eleanor stood silently in the doorway, watching him with the kind of detachment that had taken her years to perfect. There was a time when she would have been the one standing by his side, discussing strategy and polishing key talking points before a major meeting. But that was before Samantha entered the picture, before Richard decided that someone younger, flashier, and more assertive was the key to closing deals. He ended the call and turned, catching sight of her. "Morning," he said, his tone warm but distracted. "Didn't expect you to be up this early." "I couldn't sleep," she replied, her voice calm. "Big day, isn't it?" Richard chuckled, adjusting his tie in the reflection of a nearby mirror. "It is. The investors are eager to see what we have in store. If this goes well, it'll be one of our biggest acquisitions yet." Eleanor nodded, her fingers tightening slightly around the belt of her robe. "I'm sure Samantha will do an excellent job." He hesitated for a fraction of a second before responding. "She will. She understands the dynamic in those rooms." "Of course," Eleanor said, forcing a polite smile. "You've trained her well." There was a flicker of something in Richard's expression. Guilt, perhaps, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. He leaned in, brushing a kiss against her cheek, though it felt more like a formality than an expression of affection. "Don't wait up for me tonight," he said as he grabbed his briefcase. "It could be a late one." She watched as he walked out the door, his confidence radiating with every step. As soon as the door clicked shut behind him, the polite mask she wore slipped away, leaving only determination in its place. She wasn't angry anymore. She had been angry once. Angry at being overlooked, dismissed, reduced to the role of the supportive wife. But that anger had evolved into something more potent: resolve. She walked to the kitchen and poured herself a cup of coffee, savoring its warmth as she contemplated her next move. The plan she had set in motion the night before with James Donovan was only the beginning. Today would be pivotal. After a long, quiet breakfast, she changed into a sleek black pantsuit, an outfit that exuded power without needing to shout it. Her reflection in the mirror stared back at her, composed and unshakable. There was no room for doubt now. She had spent years gathering knowledge, observing Richard's strategies, and identifying the weaknesses he couldn't see. It was time to act. By mid-morning, Eleanor sat in a private corner of a downtown cafe, her tablet resting on the table as she reviewed key documents. Across from her sat James Donovan, a man known for his keen business instincts and ability to spot opportunities others overlooked. He was in his mid-50s, with silver streaks in his hair and a calm, measured demeanor that contrasted sharply with the high-energy executives Eleanor was used to. James sipped his espresso, watching her with interest. "I have to admit, Eleanor, I'm impressed. I've been following Richard's career for years, but I didn't realize you were just as sharp, if not sharper." Eleanor smiled, but there was no trace of humility in it. "Richard underestimated me. He saw me as someone who managed the household and occasionally weighed in on business matters. But I've been paying attention. I know the industry as well as he does, and more importantly, I know where he's vulnerable." James leaned back in his chair, nodding thoughtfully. "And that's why you've come to me. You want to use that knowledge to your advantage." She met his gaze, unflinching. "I'm not here to destroy him, James. I'm here to prove that I don't need him to succeed." He chuckled, tapping a finger against the rim of his cup. "Fair enough. Let's talk details. You mentioned a potential acquisition target that Richard's been circling for months." Eleanor pulled up a presentation on her tablet, sliding it across the table for James to see. "The target is undervalued, but it has long-term growth potential. Richard's strategy focuses on short-term gains, which is why he hasn't closed the deal yet. He's waiting for the numbers to line up perfectly. But by the time that happens, someone else will have taken it." James studied the data, his brow furrowing as he absorbed the details. "And you're suggesting we make a move before he does?" "Exactly," Eleanor said. "If we acquire the company now, we'll have leverage. Richard won't see it coming because he's too focused on his meeting today." A brief silence settled between them before James nodded decisively. "I'm in. You've done your homework, Eleanor. I trust your instincts." She exhaled, relief washing over her. "Good. We can finalize the terms within the next 48 hours. James smiled. "You really have been planning this for a while, haven't you?" "You have no idea," she replied, her voice carrying a hint of satisfaction. Meanwhile, across town, Richard stood in a glass-walled conference room, the city skyline stretching out behind him as he delivered a presentation with practiced ease. Samantha sat to his right, nodding at all the right moments and offering supportive comments when necessary. The investors seemed engaged, their attention shifting between the projected growth charts and the persuasive confidence in Richard's voice. But beneath the surface, there were cracks forming. One of the senior board members raised a question about contingency plans, something Richard hadn't fully addressed. Samantha stepped in to smooth things over, but Richard could feel the subtle shift in the room's energy. The meeting ended on a positive note, but it wasn't the overwhelming success he had anticipated. As he exited the building, phone in hand, he shot a message to Samantha. "We need to regroup and go over the feedback." He expected a quick response, but none came. His mind was already spinning with ideas for damage control when he spotted the notification from an industry news app. His heart stopped for a moment as he read the headline. Key acquisition finalized by Donovan Investments. His stomach twisted as realization set in. Eleanor had struck first. Eleanor Thornton arrived at the upscale cafe just as the clock struck noon, her footsteps measured and confident as she crossed the marble floor. The smell of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the faint scent of vanilla pastries, creating an atmosphere of understated luxury. She wore a tailored black blazer over a silk cream blouse, paired with slim-fit trousers and heels that clicked softly against the floor with each step. Heads turned, but she paid them no mind. Today wasn't about appearances, it was about execution. Seated at a corner table, James Donovan raised a hand in greeting. His salt and pepper hair gleamed under the natural light streaming through the wide glass windows. He looked as relaxed as ever, his posture exuding the calm authority of a man who was used to making million-dollar deals before lunch. But Eleanor knew that beneath his laid-back exterior was a mind as sharp and strategic as hers. "Right on time," James said, gesturing to the empty seat across from him. "I appreciate that. I've had years of practice meeting deadlines," Eleanor replied, setting her leather briefcase beside her chair. A waiter appeared instantly, taking her order for a cappuccino before disappearing back into the bustling cafe. "I trust you've had a chance to review everything I sent over last night?" James leaned back, tapping a finger thoughtfully against the edge of his coffee cup. "I did. And I have to say, Eleanor, you weren't kidding when you said you've been paying attention. The portfolio you've put together is comprehensive, and your analysis of the company's growth trajectory is spot on. I see why you're so confident." Eleanor offered a small smile, though there was little warmth in it. "Confidence comes from preparation. I've been preparing for this moment for years." James chuckled, shaking his head. "And Richard had no idea?" She leaned forward slightly, her gaze steady. "No. Richard assumes that silence means agreement. He stopped seeing me as a strategic partner a long time ago. That was his first mistake." James's brow lifted slightly, but he didn't press further. He respected her enough to let her tell the story at her own pace. Instead, he pulled out a copy of the proposal she had emailed him and flipped to a highlighted section. "This part intrigues me. The way you're proposing to acquire the company through a silent bid before Richard's team even realizes what's happening. It's bold." "It's necessary," Eleanor corrected. "Richard operates on a principle of timing. He waits until every piece aligns perfectly before making a move. But business doesn't wait for perfection. If we act now, we'll acquire the company while it's still undervalued, and by the time he notices, it'll be too late." James studied her, his expression thoughtful. "Do you want to outmaneuver him because it's a good deal, or because it's personal?" The question hung in the air for a moment, heavy with meaning. Eleanor didn't flinch. "Both," she admitted. "It's a good deal because I've done the research. But yes, part of me wants him to realize what he lost when he stopped seeing me as a partner. I want him to know that I didn't fade into the background because I couldn't keep up. I chose to step back and wait for the right moment. And you believe this is that moment?" She nodded firmly. "I do." Their conversation was interrupted as the waiter returned with her cappuccino, placing it neatly in front of her with a polite nod before retreating. Eleanor stirred the frothy drink thoughtfully, watching the swirls of milk blend into the dark liquid. Her mind flashed briefly to Richard, likely seated in a high-rise conference room downtown, presenting projections to investors with Samantha by his side. She could picture him adjusting his cufflinks, flashing his winning smile, believing he had the room under control. He had no idea what was coming. Across town, Richard stood at the head of a long glass conference table, his gaze sweeping over the assembled investors. The room, with its pristine white walls and panoramic view of the city, hummed with anticipation. Samantha sat to his right, her tablet glowing with charts and bullet points as she tracked the presentation. Her fitted gray blazer and sleek ponytail gave her the air of a young executive ready to conquer the world. Richard clicked through the next slide, his voice smooth and confident. As you can see, our projected revenue growth for the next quarter places us ahead of the competition. With this acquisition, we'll be able to expand into new markets without overextending our resources. A few of the investors nodded in approval, but Richard caught a hint of hesitation in the furrowed brows of two senior members. He gestured toward Samantha, who took the cue and seamlessly explained the contingencies they had in place for potential market fluctuations. It was well rehearsed, and Richard felt a swell of pride at how smoothly the presentation was going. But as the meeting progressed, the questions became sharper. Have you factored in the possibility of delays during the acquisition process? One investor asked. What if the target company experiences internal resistance? Richard smiled, masking his irritation. We've accounted for that. Our legal team is already working on strategies to minimize any roadblocks. Another investor chimed in. What about external competition? The market's been unpredictable lately. Are you confident no one else is circling this target? Richard glanced briefly at Samantha, who shifted uncomfortably in her seat. We're always aware of market competition, he replied smoothly. But we've been monitoring this target closely, and as of now, no serious threats have emerged. He hoped his answer was enough to satisfy them, but he could feel the energy in the room shifting. There was doubt in the air, and doubt was dangerous. As the meeting wrapped up, Richard shook hands with the investors, offering reassurances that any lingering concerns would be addressed in follow-up reports. But as he walked toward the elevator, the knot in his stomach tightened. He pulled out his phone and sent a quick message to Samantha. We need to meet later to go over feedback. When the elevator doors closed behind him, he let out a slow breath. He had been in tougher situations before, but something about today felt off. Meanwhile, Eleanor and James were finalizing the details of their plan over lunch. She outlined key milestones and deadlines, each step meticulously calculated. The speed and precision of her plan left James nodding in approval. You've thought of everything, he said. This isn't just about the acquisition. It's about making sure Richard has no way to recover from it. I'm not interested in destroying him, Eleanor corrected, though her tone suggested otherwise. I'm interested in showing him that I don't need him. He's been operating under the assumption that I'm stagnant, but I've been building my own path. James leaned back, a smile tugging at the corner of his lips. You're going to surprise a lot of people, Eleanor. That's the idea. As they finalized the agreement, Eleanor's phone buzzed with an alert. She glanced at the screen, a brief flicker of satisfaction crossing her face. It was an update from one of her contacts confirming that the silent bid had been successfully placed. By the time Richard received the news, it would be too late. James noticed her expression and raised an eyebrow. Everything good? Eleanor took a sip of her cappuccino, savoring its warmth. Perfect. The afternoon sun spilled across the city skyline, casting long golden streaks over the streets below as Richard Thornton stepped out of the towering glass building that housed his company's headquarters. The meeting had gone well enough, or so he told himself. The investors had shown interest, asked all the right questions, and seemed mostly satisfied. But a nagging sensation gnawed at the back of his mind. Something about the meeting had felt off, like an itch he couldn't scratch, and he hated loose ends. He adjusted his tie as the automatic doors slid shut behind him, and Samantha followed closely, her heels clicking rhythmically against the pavement. I think the presentation went fine, she said, scrolling through her tablet as they walked. Most of their concerns were standard. Nothing to worry about. Richard nodded, but her words didn't provide the reassurance he craved. We need to address their doubts about external competition, he said, his voice clipped. Set up a meeting with the legal team. I want them to triple-check that no rival firms are circling our target. I'll get on it, Samantha replied, but even she sounded less confident than usual. As Richard climbed into the waiting car, the soft hum of the city faded into the background, replaced by the steady tapping of his fingers against the leather seat. The car glided smoothly through traffic, but his mind raced in chaotic directions, replaying every question the investors had asked. His phone buzzed, pulling him out of his thoughts. He reached for it, expecting a message from the legal team, or perhaps from Eleanor. Instead, It was an alert from a financial news app. Donovan Investments finalizes key acquisition. His brow furrowed as he opened the article. The headline was innocuous enough, but as he scanned the details, his pulse quickened. Donovan Investments had acquired the same company Richard had been pursuing. The deal had been finalized quietly, without the fanfare typical of such takeovers. And yet, here it was, announced as if it had been in the works for months. "What the hell?" he muttered under his breath. Samantha noticed his change in demeanor. "What's wrong?" "Donovan just closed the acquisition we were targeting," Richard said, his voice low but laced with frustration. "How did this happen without us knowing?" Samantha blinked, momentarily stunned. "That's impossible. We've been monitoring the competition. Donovan wasn't even on our radar." "Well, he's on it now," Richard snapped, shoving the phone back into his pocket. He leaned back against the seat, running a hand through his hair. The pieces weren't adding up, and that infuriated him. Donovan had never shown any serious interest in that company, at least, not publicly. Someone had tipped him off. Someone had seen the opportunity Richard had been waiting for and seized it before he could. The car pulled up to the entrance of their penthouse, the sleek black exterior of the building gleaming in the late afternoon light. Richard stepped out, barely acknowledging the doorman as he made his way inside. The elevator ride to the top floor was suffocating, each second stretching longer than the last. His thoughts spiraled, jumping from Samantha's reassurances to the investor's doubts and finally settling on Eleanor. She had been quiet this morning, too quiet, and that damn smile she'd given him before he left. It had lingered in the back of his mind all day. Could she have known something? Had she seen this coming? When the elevator doors slid open, the silence of the penthouse greeted him like an unwelcome guest. The soft hum of the refrigerator was the only sound, and the absence of Eleanor's usual presence was jarring. The kitchen was spotless, the living room impeccably arranged, but the space felt empty, like a stage after the actors had left. Richard set his briefcase on the counter and loosened his tie. His phone buzzed again, and he hesitated before glancing at the screen. It was a message from one of his internal analysts. Confirmation: Donovan Investments finalized the acquisition at 10 a.m. today. Sources indicate the bid was placed late last night. Late last night. His jaw tightened as he remembered Eleanor moving around the penthouse quietly after dinner, her phone never far from her reach. Could she have been working with Donovan? No, that was ridiculous. Eleanor wasn't the type to. His train of thought was interrupted as the front door opened and Eleanor walked in, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. She carried a leather bag over her shoulder, her expression serene but unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of unspoken suspicions hanging in the air between them. "You're home early," she said, setting her bag on the entryway table. "The meeting wrapped up sooner than expected," Richard replied, watching her carefully. "How was your day?" Eleanor shrugged, her gaze briefly meeting his before she walked toward the kitchen. "Productive." The word sent a chill down his spine. He followed her, leaning against the counter as she poured herself a glass of water. "Did you hear about the Donovan deal?" he asked casually, though his heart pounded in anticipation of her reaction. She didn't flinch. "I did. Big news." He narrowed his eyes. "It's the same company we were targeting. Strange timing, don't you think?" Eleanor sipped her water, setting the glass down gently before turning to face him fully. "Business moves fast, Richard. You know that better than anyone." Her calmness was maddening. "Did you know this was happening?" he asked, his voice sharper now. Eleanor tilted her head slightly, as if considering how to answer. "Would it matter if I did?" His breath hitched, and for a moment, he struggled to find the right words. "Yes, it would matter. Because I can't shake the feeling that someone tipped Donovan off. And considering how quiet you've been lately," her lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "You think I had something to do with it?" "I don't know what to think," he admitted, his voice softer but still tense. "But it's a hell of a coincidence." Eleanor stepped closer, her gaze steady. "For years, Richard, you've made decisions without consulting me. You've built this empire on your terms, expecting me to stay in the background. So, let me ask you, why does it surprise you now that I've taken matters into my own hands?" The air between them crackled with tension. Richard's mind raced, trying to reconcile the woman standing before him with the image he had of the supportive, accommodating wife he thought he knew. Had she really outmaneuvered him? And if so, how long had she been planning it? "You've been working with Donovan," he said, more a statement than a question. Eleanor didn't deny it. "I've been working for myself." Her words hit him like a blow, but beneath the shock was something he hadn't expected: admiration. Despite his anger, he couldn't ignore the brilliance of her move. She had done what he prided himself on, seeing an opportunity and taking it. "So, what now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor picked up her glass of water, her gaze unwavering. "Now, I keep moving forward. Whether you choose to keep up is entirely up to you." With that, she walked past him, her heels clicking against the marble floor as she disappeared into the bedroom, leaving Richard standing alone in the kitchen, the weight of her words sinking deeper into his chest. For the first time in years, he felt like the one left behind. The soft hum of Richard Thornton's phone vibrated against the polished wood of his desk. He ignored it, running a hand through his dark hair as he stared down at the stack of reports his assistant had placed there earlier. His mind wasn't on the neatly printed financial projections or the detailed analyses of future market expansions. It was stuck on the headline that had tormented him since the day before. Donovan Investments finalizes key acquisition. Even after spending half the night trying to piece together how it had happened, Richard still didn't have an answer. He had contacted the legal team, grilled his analysts, and demanded a review of every report related to the acquisition. But no one had seen it coming. Donovan had swooped in quietly and efficiently, like a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. What gnawed at him wasn't just the loss of the deal, it was the timing. The bid had been placed late the previous night, shortly after he'd left for dinner with Samantha. Eleanor had been home. He couldn't shake the feeling that her eerie calm during their conversation that morning wasn't just a coincidence. He leaned back in his chair, eyes closing briefly as the sounds of the bustling city filtered through the window behind him. Was Eleanor really capable of pulling something like this off? Had she spent years quietly observing him, learning his weaknesses, and waiting for the moment to use them against him? The thought unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. He had always assumed Eleanor was content in her role, supporting him, organizing their lives, and offering quiet advice when needed. But this wasn't the behavior of a passive woman. This was the work of someone who had been planning, calculating. The phone buzzed again, and this time, he snatched it up. Samantha's name glared back at him, the letters sharp and accusatory. He answered with a clipped, "What is it?" "We've got another problem," Samantha said, her voice tight. "One of our investors just pulled out of the expansion project. They said they're reconsidering their involvement due to market instability." Richard sat up straighter, his jaw tightening. "Which investor?" "Greenstone Capital." He swore under his breath, running a hand over his face. "Did they say what triggered the decision?" Samantha hesitated. "They mentioned the Donovan acquisition. Apparently, Donovan's team has been positioning themselves as a more stable alternative." "Stable?" Richard's laugh was bitter. "They wouldn't be stable if they hadn't stolen our target." Samantha didn't respond immediately, and that silence told him everything he needed to know. Even she was beginning to sense that they were slipping. "I'm heading over to Greenstone now to see if I can convince them to reconsider," she finally said. "Good," Richard replied. "Let me know how it goes." He ended the call and tossed the phone onto the desk, leaning forward and burying his face in his hands. He needed to figure out his next move. Fast. At the same time, Eleanor Thornton was calmly sipping her tea in a private conference room at Donovan Investments. The floor-to-ceiling windows bathed the space in natural light, casting soft shadows across the table where James Donovan sat reviewing documents. Unlike Richard's tension-filled environment, this room felt serene. An oasis of control. James set down the stack of papers, leaning back with a satisfied expression. "The response from the market has been better than expected," he said. "With this acquisition, we're not just gaining assets, we're gaining trust. Investors are already shifting their focus from Thornton Enterprises to us." Eleanor smiled faintly, stirring her tea without breaking eye contact. Richard built his empire on quick wins and flashy expansions. But trust, real trust, comes from long-term stability. That's what we're offering. James nodded, admiration evident in his gaze. I have to hand it to you, Eleanor. When you first approached me, I didn't expect this level of precision. You knew exactly where to strike. I've been watching Richard for years, she said, setting down her spoon. I know his strengths, but more importantly, I know his blind spots. James chuckled. And you exploited them perfectly. What's your next move? Eleanor's gaze drifted to the cityscape beyond the window, her mind already several steps ahead. He won't give up easily. Right now, he's scrambling to figure out how this happened. I expect he'll come after me soon, but that's fine. I'm prepared. James tapped his fingers against the table, intrigued. Do you think he'll try to win you back? Her laugh was soft but cold. Richard doesn't like losing, but he won't be trying to win me back for sentimental reasons. It'll be about pride. And if he does? James asked, leaning forward. Eleanor met his gaze, her expression hardening. It's too late. Back at Thornton Enterprises, Richard paced his office like a caged lion. The afternoon sun had begun its descent, casting long shadows across the room. He had spent the last hour poring over everything his team could find on the Donovan acquisition, but the details were airtight. There was no obvious breach, no sign of insider knowledge, nothing that could explain how they had beaten him to the punch. The intercom buzzed, and his assistant's voice crackled through the speaker. Mr. Thornton, your wife is here to see you. Richard froze. Eleanor hadn't set foot in his office in months. What was she doing here now? Send her in, he said, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. The door opened, and Eleanor stepped inside, her presence commanding yet understated. She wore a tailored navy dress that hugged her figure, paired with black heels that clicked softly against the floor. Her hair was pinned back, revealing the graceful curve of her neck, but it was her eyes, cool and calculating, that held his attention. Eleanor, he said, masking his confusion with a practiced smile. What brings you here? She approached his desk, setting her handbag on the chair before sitting across from him. I thought it was time we talked. His fingers drummed lightly against the desk. About the Donovan deal? Her lips curved slightly. Among other things, silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken accusations. Richard leaned back in his chair, studying her as if seeing her for the first time. You knew about the acquisition before it happened, didn't you? Eleanor didn't flinch. I did. How? The word was a demand, sharp and cutting. I've been working with James Donovan for months, she replied, her tone steady. While you were focused on short-term gains, I was building something sustainable. Anger flared in his chest. So, this was your revenge? No, her response was immediate. This was my realization that I didn't need to wait for you to see my potential. I spent years supporting you, Richard. Years believing we were a team. But somewhere along the way, you stopped seeing me as your partner. So, I became my own. He swallowed hard, the weight of her words pressing down on him. And now, she said, standing, I'm exactly where I want to be. Richard watched her as she picked up her handbag and walked toward the door. His mind raced, searching for something to say, something that would make her stay. But he knew it wouldn't matter. She had already made her decision. As the door closed behind her, the silence of the office felt suffocating. For the first time in his career, Richard Thornton felt the sting of defeat, not just in business, but in something far deeper. And the worst part? He knew he had no one to blame but himself. The city lights flickered like fireflies against the black curtain of night as Richard Thornton stood on the penthouse balcony, the cool breeze cutting through his tailored shirt. He gripped the glass railing tightly, his knuckles whitening as his mind replayed Eleanor's words from earlier that day. I didn't need to wait for you to see my potential. I became my own. He hadn't been able to respond. He'd simply watched her leave his office, her footsteps steady, her confidence unwavering. Eleanor, his Eleanor, had outmaneuvered him. She had spent years in the shadows, silently observing, and when she finally struck, it was with the precision of someone who had been preparing for this moment far longer than he had anticipated. He took a slow sip of scotch, the burn barely registering as his thoughts churned. His phone buzzed on the outdoor table, pulling him from his haze. The screen lit up with Samantha's name. For a moment, he debated ignoring it, but his instincts kicked in, and he answered with a terse, "What now?" "We're hemorrhaging investors," Samantha said, her voice fraught with tension. "Greenstone is officially out, and their withdrawal triggered a domino effect. 2 other firms have suspended their support until further notice." Richard pinched the bridge of his nose, his pulse quickening. "Did they give a reason?" "Uncertainty. They're worried about how we'll recover after Donovan blindsided us." He exhaled sharply, pacing the length of the balcony. "Set up a meeting with our core investors tomorrow morning. I'll convince them to stay." Samantha hesitated. "Richard, they're starting to wonder if you've lost your edge. They see this as a major blow, one you didn't anticipate." Her words hit harder than she probably intended, and for a moment, he said nothing, staring out at the city that had once felt like his playground but now seemed like an endless maze. "I'll fix it," he said finally, though even he wasn't sure how. As he ended the call, the echo of Samantha's warning lingered in his mind. "They're starting to wonder if you've lost your edge." Had he? For years, Richard had prided himself on staying 10 steps ahead of everyone. Competitors, investors, even allies. But Eleanor's move had caught him completely off guard. She had anticipated his every reaction, leaving him scrambling to pick up the pieces of a deal he had once thought was a sure thing. He finished the scotch and stepped back inside, the warmth of the penthouse doing little to ease the chill in his bones. He loosened his tie and collapsed onto the leather couch, his head leaning back against the cushions. The silence was deafening, save for the faint hum of traffic below. His thoughts drifted back to the early years of his marriage. Eleanor had been by his side through it all. Those late nights when they strategized over takeout, the early mornings when she double-checked his presentations, the moments when she offered insights that often proved more valuable than he had initially realized. He had relied on her, though he had rarely acknowledged it. Somewhere along the way, he had taken her presence for granted, assuming she would always be there, content in the role he had assigned her. But Eleanor hadn't been content. She had been evolving, and he hadn't noticed. The memory of her smile that morning, the calm, knowing curve of her lips, nagged at him. She had known. She had anticipated everything, including his shock. Driven by a sudden need for answers, he stood and crossed the room to his home office. The glow of the city illuminated the sleek mahogany desk where his laptop sat, waiting like a lifeline. He opened it and logged into his secure server, scanning through the most recent emails, financial reports, and internal memos. He needed to understand how Eleanor had orchestrated this. An email from one of his senior analysts caught his eye. Internal audit of Thornton Enterprises, preliminary report. His stomach twisted as he opened it, scanning the lines of text. The report detailed various potential vulnerabilities within the company, weak points Eleanor would have known about. But it wasn't the vulnerabilities themselves that sent a chill down his spine. It was the timeline. The report had been compiled over the course of several months. Eleanor had access to this information long before Donovan made his move. He closed the laptop and leaned back in his chair, the weight of realization pressing down on him. Eleanor hadn't just stumbled into an opportunity. She had built one, piece by piece. The sound of the front door opening pulled him from his thoughts. He stood and walked toward the living room, where Eleanor was slipping off her heels and placing her bag on the entryway table. She looked up, surprised to see him still awake. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked, her voice calm as ever. "Something like that," he replied, his gaze unwavering. "Where were you?" Eleanor shrugged, walking past him toward the kitchen. "Meeting with investors." He followed her, leaning against the counter as she poured herself a glass of water. "Donovan?" She sipped the water, setting the glass down before turning to face him fully. "Why does it matter?" "Because I need to know how long you've been planning this." Eleanor studied him, her gaze steady but unreadable. "Long enough." The simplicity of her response stung. "You could have told me," he said, his voice quieter now. "You didn't have to go behind my back." She exhaled, leaning against the counter. "I tried telling you. Do you remember the last time I brought up one of your deals and suggested a different approach? You dismissed me without a second thought. You stopped listening, Richard. So, I stopped talking." He rubbed the back of his neck, guilt intertwining with frustration. "And this is your way of getting back at me?" "This isn't about revenge," Eleanor said firmly. "It's about me choosing to stop waiting for you to see my worth." Her words hung in the air, heavy and final. Richard wanted to argue, to tell her that she was wrong, that he had always valued her. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. He had seen her as an extension of himself, someone who supported him but never challenged his authority. "I didn't think you had this in you," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's the problem," she replied, her tone soft but resolute. "You never saw me for who I really am." The silence that followed was suffocating. Richard's mind raced, searching for a way to salvage not just the business but their relationship. But for the first time in his life, he felt powerless. "What happens now?" he asked, dreading her answer. Eleanor smiled faintly, though there was no triumph in it, only a quiet acceptance of the path she had chosen. "Now, you figure out how to move forward without me." With that, she picked up her glass and walked toward the bedroom, leaving Richard standing alone in the dimly lit kitchen. The hum of the refrigerator filled the void she left behind, but it did nothing to ease the ache in his chest. As he stood there, the weight of her words settled over him, suffocating and unrelenting. For the first time in years, Richard Thornton was truly alone. And this time, it wasn't by choice. The late-night glow of Manhattan cast soft shadows across the walls of Richard Thornton's office, where he sat slumped over his desk, fingers buried in his hair. The heavy oak desk, once a symbol of his success and power, now felt suffocating. Beside him, half-empty coffee cups and scattered papers told the story of his desperate search for answers. But tonight, there were none. The silence in the room pressed down on him, broken only by the occasional hum of the air conditioner. Hours ago, Eleanor had delivered the final blow, walking away after revealing the depth of her betrayal, or perhaps her liberation. Richard wasn't sure which stung more, her strategic brilliance or the fact that he had never seen it coming. His thoughts swirled with memories, late nights when she sat across from him in this very office, offering advice he had brushed off, quiet evenings when her presence faded into the background as he focused on the next big deal. He had always assumed she was content. That was his mistake. Leaning back in his chair, he reached for the glass of scotch sitting precariously on the edge of the desk. The amber liquid sloshed as he took a sip, the warmth barely registering as it slid down his throat. He stared at the ceiling, letting the alcohol numb the gnawing ache in his chest. But even the scotch couldn't dull the reality he was now forced to confront. He had underestimated her, and now everything was unraveling. His phone buzzed, the vibration rattling against the wooden surface. He glanced at the screen. Another message from Samantha. He didn't need to read it to know what it said. Another investor was pulling out, another opportunity slipping through his fingers. It was the same story on repeat, a symphony of failure playing in the background of his once flawless career. With a groan, he tossed the phone aside, the sound of it clattering against the desk echoing through the room. He couldn't focus on damage control anymore. Not tonight. What he needed was clarity, an understanding of how things had spiraled so far out of his control. He pushed himself up from the chair and walked to the large window overlooking the city. The skyline glittered like a sea of diamonds, but the sight no longer filled him with pride. Instead, it felt distant, mocking. Somewhere out there, Eleanor was probably celebrating her victory. Or maybe she wasn't. Maybe she was simply relieved to be free of him. A soft knock at the door startled him. He turned, frowning. It was nearly midnight. Who would come to see him now? He hesitated before crossing the room and opening the door, half expecting Samantha with another urgent update. But it wasn't Samantha. It was his father. The sight of Robert Thornton standing in the doorway, wearing a charcoal gray overcoat and carrying a leather briefcase, was enough to jolt Richard out of his haze. His father, a man who had built his own empire before handing over the reins to Richard, was the last person he expected to see tonight. "Dad," Richard said, stepping aside to let him in. "What are you doing here?" Robert entered the room, his sharp eyes scanning the disarray of papers and empty coffee cups before settling on his son. "You didn't answer my calls," he said simply. "So, I figured I'd come see you myself." Richard sighed, closing the door behind him. I've been busy. I can see that. Robert set his briefcase on the coffee table and removed his coat, draping it over the back of the couch. Samantha called me. Of course, she did. Samantha had been loyal to Richard for years, but when things got messy, she always knew when to call reinforcements. What did she tell you? Richard asked, pouring another glass of scotch and offering one to his father, who shook his head. Enough, Robert replied, sinking into the armchair by the window. She said you've lost 2 major investors. Donovan blindsided you with the acquisition, and your wife. He paused, choosing his words carefully. Played a larger role in this than anyone expected. Richard laughed bitterly. That's an understatement. Robert leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Tell me what happened, Richard. He hesitated, the weight of the truth pressing against his chest. But there was no point in hiding it. Not from his father. Eleanor outplayed me, he admitted, sinking into the chair across from him. She's been planning this for months, maybe longer. While I was focused on expanding the company, she was quietly aligning herself with Donovan. By the time I realized what was happening, it was too late. Robert nodded, his expression unreadable. And now you're wondering how you missed it. More like how I missed her, Richard muttered, running a hand through his hair. She was right in front of me this whole time, and I didn't see her. I didn't see what she was capable of. The silence between them was heavy, stretching like a chasm that neither seemed eager to bridge. Finally, Robert spoke. Do you know why I gave you this company instead of keeping it for myself? Richard looked up, confused. Because you said it was my turn. Robert shook his head. No, I gave it to you because I knew you had the ambition to take it further than I ever could. But ambition can be a double-edged sword. It can drive you to success, but it can also blind you to the people who matter most. Richard swallowed hard, the truth of his father's words cutting deep. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought building the company bigger and faster would make everyone proud. But at what cost? Robert asked, his gaze piercing. You built the company, yes. But in doing so, you pushed away the person who helped you build it in the first place. Eleanor wasn't just your wife. She was your partner. You forgot that. I didn't forget, Richard said defensively. I got caught up. And now you're paying the price. The weight of those words settled heavily on Richard's shoulders. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees as he stared at the floor. I don't know how to fix this, Dad, Robert sighed, leaning back in the chair. You can't fix everything, Richard. Some things are meant to be lessons, not solutions. Maybe this is one of those times. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. For years, he had prided himself on being able to fix any problem, to outmaneuver any obstacle. But this was different. Eleanor wasn't just another competitor. She was the woman he had built his life with, and he had taken her for granted. Do you still love her? Robert asked quietly. Richard's breath hitched. Did he? The answer should have been obvious, but now, it felt like a question wrapped in layers of guilt and regret. I don't know, he admitted. I think I do. But I don't think it matters anymore. Robert stood, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. Then maybe it's time to stop thinking about what you've lost and start thinking about what you can learn. If you want to rebuild, start with yourself. Richard nodded, though the path ahead felt uncertain. His father's words stayed with him long after he left, echoing in the quiet room. Start with yourself. For the first time in years, Richard realized that success wasn't just about winning. It was about understanding who you were when everything fell apart. And tonight, he wasn't the man he thought he'd be. But maybe, just maybe, he could become someone better. The crowd outside the conference hall buzzed with anticipation, their voices blending into a hum of excitement as cameras flashed and reporters jostled for position. The large glass building stood as a beacon of modern success, its towering height and reflective facade symbolizing the power plays happening within. It wasn't just any press conference, it was the press conference. The one that would signal a turning point in the industry, and everyone in the room knew it. Richard Thornton adjusted his cufflinks as he entered through the side entrance, avoiding the throng of reporters stationed outside. The weight of exhaustion pressed heavily on his shoulders, but his face was carefully composed. betraying none of the turmoil he had experienced in recent days. He wasn't invited to the event, of course, but that didn't matter. He needed to be here. He needed to see her. He slipped into the back of the large conference room, blending seamlessly into the crowd of industry professionals and media representatives. The room was sleek and modern, with rows of chairs facing a polished stage where a podium awaited. The air was thick with expectation. His gaze shifted toward the front row, where James Donovan sat confidently, flanked by his team of executives. But Richard wasn't here for James. He was here for the woman who had orchestrated this entire coup with the precision of a chess grandmaster. And there she was. Eleanor Thornton stepped onto the stage, the overhead lights casting a halo around her as the room fell silent. She was the picture of composure in a fitted white blazer and black trousers, her hair pulled neatly into a low bun. The simplicity of her attire only emphasized her natural grace and authority. Gone was the woman who once stood quietly in Richard's shadow. Today, she commanded the room. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice steady and clear. "Thank you for joining us today. I understand there's been a lot of speculation about recent developments, and I'm here to provide clarity on what this means for our industry and for the future." Richard felt a knot tighten in his chest as he watched her. She exuded a calm confidence that made it impossible to look away. He had always known she was capable, but this was something else entirely. She wasn't just capable. She was in control. Eleanor continued, outlining the strategic benefits of the recent acquisition and the vision for the future of Donovan Investments. Her words were measured, each statement backed by data and delivered with conviction. The audience hung on her every word, nodding in agreement as she painted a picture of growth, stability, and innovation. But it wasn't just the content of her speech that held their attention. It was her presence. She spoke not as someone filling a temporary role, but as a leader who had earned her place at the top. And the way she carried herself made it clear that she wasn't going anywhere. Richard's fingers tightened around the armrest of his chair. He had come here expecting to feel anger, resentment, anything to fuel his need for a comeback. But instead, all he felt was regret. Regret for the moments he had dismissed her insights, for the nights when he had been too focused on his own success to see hers unfolding quietly beside him. The applause that erupted at the end of her speech was deafening, and as the crowd rose to their feet, Richard remained seated, his gaze locked on her as she stepped down from the podium. She smiled politely as she shook hands with key investors and executives, navigating the room with ease. She was a woman who knew exactly where she belonged. Richard watched as she made her way toward the exit, her movements graceful yet purposeful. He hesitated, his heart pounding, before finally standing and following her. The crowd thinned as they exited the main hall, and he caught up to her just as she reached the lobby. "Eleanor." She turned, her expression neutral but not surprised. "Richard." For a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of their shared history hanging between them like an invisible thread. The echoes of their past reverberated in the silence, the late nights spent brainstorming ideas, the quiet moments of laughter, and the slow unraveling that had led them here. "I wasn't sure you'd come," she said, breaking the silence. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I had to see it for myself." Her gaze softened, though her posture remained firm. "And what did you see?" "I saw what I should have seen a long time ago," he admitted, his voice raw. "You weren't just my partner, Eleanor. You were my equal, and I was too blind to recognize that." Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line, as if she were weighing his words. "It's too late for apologies, Richard." "I'm not here to apologize," he said quickly. "I'm here to acknowledge what you've accomplished. You did this without me, and you did it brilliantly." She tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "Why now? Why acknowledge it after everything has already fallen apart?" "Because I finally understand what I lost," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And I'm not just talking about the business." Her eyes flickered with something. Pain, maybe, or perhaps nostalgia, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "We can't go back, Richard. You know that." "I do," he admitted. "But that doesn't mean I don't regret how things ended." Eleanor sighed, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "I didn't want this to be about revenge, you know. I didn't set out to destroy you. I know, he said, stepping closer. You set out to prove that you didn't need me. And you were right. Silence enveloped them once more, but this time, it felt different. Less like a chasm and more like a bridge being built, one plank at a time. Richard searched her face for any sign of forgiveness, but what he found was something far more valuable: respect. I hope you find what you're looking for, she said softly, her gaze steady. But it's not going to be with me. He nodded, the truth of her words sinking in. I hope you know how proud I am of you. For the first time, Eleanor's composure cracked, and a hint of emotion flickered across her face. Thank you, she whispered. With that, she turned and walked away, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. Richard stood there, watching her until she disappeared through the revolving doors and into the bustling city beyond. The sound of her departure echoed in his ears, but this time, it wasn't the sound of loss. It was the sound of closure. As he left the building and stepped into the cool night air, Richard felt a strange sense of relief. He had lost the battle, but perhaps in doing so, he had gained something more valuable: the understanding that success wasn't about winning every fight. Sometimes, it was about knowing when to let go. And tonight, he was finally ready to let go.